The fire came as a rumor on the wind, a whisper of smoke long before the orange beast crested the horizon. It moved with the hunger of a starved god across the sun-baked plains, consuming miles of brittle grass in a single, roaring breath. From the town, they watched the column of soot climb into the pristine blue sky, a dark monument to the inevitable. They watched it sweep toward the lone farmhouse on the bluffs, the one they all knew was doomed, the one belonging to the widow Annalise. Her folly, they had called it. Her madness. For years, they had seen her planting sticks in the dirt, creating a dense, unnatural thicket where open land ought to be. Now, that folly would be her funeral pyre. The wind, which had been her constant tormentor, was now the fire's cruelest ally, driving the flames directly at her door. Men gathered their bucket brigades, but they knew it was hopeless. Their efforts were for the town, not for the isolated woman who had chosen sticks over sense. The banker, Mr. Hemlock, stood on the edge of town, his face a mask of grim calculation as he watched the property he was days from repossessing turn to ash. The fire hit the strange, dark perimeter of her land not with a triumphant roar, but with a sudden, choked hiss. The wall of green, a dense tapestry of pine and poplar and hardy aspen woven together over seasons of silent labor, did not explode into flame. It sizzled. It steamed. The outer layer blackened and died, sacrificing itself to the heat, but the inner layers, cool and damp with life, held fast. The great river of fire, denied its easy meal, was forced apart, flowing around the green island of her home like water around a stubborn stone. Inside that circle of salvation, the farmhouse stood untouched, bathed in an eerie, orange twilight, the air thick with the smell of burning prairie and hot pine. And on the porch, a lone figure stood, watching the apocalypse divide and pass her by. Her face was smudged with soot, her knuckles white on the railing, but she did not tremble. She simply watched the world burn around the sanctuary she had built with her own 2 hands, a testament to a promise no one else had understood. How she had come to stand there, in the eye of the inferno, was a story rooted not in madness, but in the quiet, unyielding soil of grief. The silence after Daniel's burial was a physical presence, a weight that settled over the small farmhouse and pressed the air from Annalise's lungs. The vast, empty sky and the relentless wind that scoured the plains were no longer elements of a life they were building together, they were vultures circling a carcass. Her mother, Maeve, moved through the house like a ghost, her face etched with a fear that was sharper than her sorrow. The land was too much, too hard, too empty. Daniel had been the bulwark against it, his broad shoulders and steady optimism the only reason this place had ever felt like home. Without him, it was just a wooden box on a sea of grass, waiting to be overwhelmed. It was on the 3rd day of this suffocating silence that Mr. Hemlock's carriage appeared, a black speck growing steadily larger against the pale earth. He did not waste time with condolences. He sat stiffly in Daniel's chair, his ledger open on his knee, the numbers a cold, final judgment. "The loan is considerable, Mrs. Thorne," he stated, his voice devoid of warmth. Daniel was a good man, but sentiment does not pay debts. "The first winter alone out here, it's not survivable for 2 women. The bank must be practical. I can offer you a fair price, enough to see you settled back east with your sister." His words were not a suggestion, they were a verdict. Annalise stared at his polished shoes, at the dust of her land upon them, and felt a cold rage begin to smolder beneath the ash of her grief. This was her home. The floorboards beneath her feet held the echo of Daniel's laughter. The window panes framed the sunrises they had watched together. To leave was to bury him a second time. That night, unable to sleep, she found it. His journal. Tucked away in a loose board beneath their bed. She had expected accounts, lists of supplies, the practical thoughts of a practical man. But the pages were filled with something else entirely. They were filled with drawings of trees. Not the lonely, twisted cottonwoods that clung to the distant creek bed, but dense, deliberate forests. There were sketches of her farmhouse nestled within a living wall of green, notes scrawled in the margins about root systems, soil retention, and the way a stand of poplars could blunt the force of the north wind. He had titled the section, "The Fortress." It was his secret dream, his long-term plan to tame the brutal landscape not by fighting it, but by yielding to it, by planting a shield that would grow stronger with each passing season. He had been planning to protect her all along. In the quiet of the pre-dawn house, holding the book to her chest, Anneliese felt his presence more keenly than she had since the funeral. A new purpose took root in her exhausted heart. She would not run. She would build his fortress. The work began before the ground had fully thawed. Anneliese took the small amount of money left from the sale of their second ox and sent away for saplings, hundreds of them. They arrived in burlap-wrapped bundles, looking like nothing more than pathetic sticks, their roots still damp with the soil of a distant, kinder place. Maeve watched from the doorway, her hands twisting in her apron, her face a mask of despair. "Anneliese, what is this madness? That was our winter money. We need flour, not twigs." Anneliese did not argue. She simply took her shovel, the one Daniel's hands had worn smooth, and broke the earth. The digging was brutal. The prairie soil was a stubborn, tangled mat of grass roots and packed clay, and each hole was a battle fought against the land itself. She worked from sunrise until the last light failed, her body screaming with a chorus of new aches. Her hands, once soft, became a cartographer's map of her labor, blistered, then calloused, then cracked and bleeding. She would come inside at night, too tired to eat, and fall into a heavy, dreamless sleep, only to rise with the sun and begin again. The neighbors, when they rode by, would slow their horses and stare. Thomas, whose land bordered hers to the west, reined in one afternoon, a look of pity mixed with scorn on his face. "What are you doing, widow?" Praying for a forest to grow overnight, he called out, a dry chuckle in his throat. "That won't stop the wind, and it surely won't stop the bank." Anneliese paused, leaning on her shovel, her back a straight line of defiance. She looked at the tiny, vulnerable sapling in the hole at her feet, then back at him. "It will," she said, her voice quiet but firm, carrying on the wind that sought to tear the words from her lips. She offered no other explanation. She turned back to her work, the rhythmic thrust of the shovel her only reply. Her world shrank to the circle of her labor, the sharp scent of turned earth, the strain in her shoulders, the satisfying tap as the soil was packed around a new root ball. Each sapling was a promise, a prayer, a single word in a long and defiant sentence she was writing across the face of the land. She was not planting twigs. She was planting armor. She was planting a future. And as she worked, she felt Daniel's spirit beside her, not as a haunting grief, but as a silent, encouraging presence, his dream taking root in the stubborn soil through the strength of her hands. The first winter arrived not as a gentle blanket of snow but as a besieging army. The wind came first, a low moan from the north that grew over days into a high, violent shriek. It was a living thing, a predator that clawed at the farmhouse, rattling the windows in their frames and finding every tiny crack in the walls to force its icy breath through. The world outside the windows dissolved into a churning vortex of white. For days on end, they were trapped, the house a fragile ship in a frozen hurricane. Anneliese spent those days moving from window to window, her heart a tight knot of fear as she watched the blizzard assault her fledgling forest. The saplings, which had seemed so hopefully green against the autumn brown, were now skeletal and fragile, whipped back and forth by the gale. Each one that snapped, its tiny trunk giving way to the relentless force, felt like a personal wound. She had failed them. She had failed Daniel. Maeve's fear festered in the close confines of the cabin, turning to a bitter resentment. "I told you this was folly," she would whisper, her voice thin and reedy as the wind outside. "Wasted everything on sticks that will be dead by spring. We will starve. We will freeze. This is what your pride has brought us to." Anneliese had no words to offer. The truth of her mother's fear was a cold stone in her own stomach. Their supply of firewood dwindled at an alarming rate. The food stores shrank. Some mornings they would wake to find a fine layer of frost on their blankets, their own breath pluming in the frigid air. The isolation was absolute. There was no town, no neighbors, only the ceaseless, deafening roar of the storm. During a brief lull, when the wind paused to draw breath, Anneliese bundled herself in every layer she owned and fought her way outside. The cold was shocking, a physical blow that stole the air from her lungs. She waded through waist-deep drifts to the nearest line of trees, her hands clumsy with cold as she worked. She used strips of burlap and twine to lash the most vulnerable saplings to stakes she had pounded in before the ground froze. She built small walls of packed snow around their bases, desperate attempts to shield them from the wind's worst fury. It was a hopeless, frantic effort against an overwhelming force, but it was action. It was a fight. And as she worked, her fingers numb and her face raw from the cold, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. She was not just protecting the trees, they were focusing her will, giving her a reason to stand against the storm when everything else told her to surrender. As the snows of winter grudgingly retreated, revealing a landscape scoured clean and barren, the reality of their financial situation became as stark and unforgiving as the frozen ground. The money was gone. Their credit at the general store in town, once freely given when Daniel was alive, had become a strained and tenuous thing. Mr. Gable, the proprietor, would avoid her eyes as he tallied her meager purchases, his face a study in worried sympathy. He was a kind man, but he had a family and a business to protect. Annalise bought only the barest necessities: flour, salt, beans. The thought of buying more saplings to replace the ones lost to the winter was a painful, impossible luxury. Her fortress had breaches in its walls before it had even had a chance to grow. One crisp spring morning, Mr. Hemlock's carriage returned. This time, he did not bother to come inside. He handed her a letter from his seat, his expression impatient. The letter was cold, formal, and brutal. It spoke of foreclosure, of deadlines, of the unassailable logic of debt. "You have until the end of summer," he stated, his gaze sweeping over the thin lines of her planted trees with open contempt. "The land is worth something. The house is not. Do not imagine this, gardening will change the numbers on my ledger." He drove away, leaving Annalise standing with the notice in her hand, the paper trembling with the force of her own silent fury. Maeve saw the letter and collapsed into a state of resigned despair. She began packing a small trunk, her movement slow and defeated. "It is over, Annalise. We must write to my sister. We must accept charity. Your husband's dream has broken us," but seeing her mother's surrender only hardened Annalise's resolve. The banker's contempt, her mother's defeatism, the town's pity, it all became fuel. That evening, she walked out to the edge of her property. The surviving saplings were beginning to show the faintest blush of green at their tips. They were bent and scarred from the winter, but they were alive. They had endured. She knelt in the dirt, touching a tiny, emerging leaf. It was so fragile, yet so stubbornly insistent on living. It was a mirror of the feeling in her own heart. She would not be broken. She began taking on mending work from the town, sewing late into the night by candlelight, her eyes burning with exhaustion, earning pennies that she painstakingly saved. She foraged for wild greens and roots, learning the land's secret larders. Every action, no matter how small, was a defiance. She was buying time, one stitch, one root, one day at a time, for her trees to grow. The summer that followed was as cruel in its heat as the winter had been in its cold. The sky became a vast, brassy dome from which the sun beat down without mercy. The rains refused to come. The prairie grass cured to a crisp, pale yellow, and the earth cracked open like a parched mouth. A deep, persistent thirst settled over the land, and Annalise's young trees began to suffer. Their new leaves, once so vibrant, curled at the edges and drooped in the punishing afternoon heat. The creek, a mile's walk from the farmhouse, shrank to a muddy trickle, but it was the only source of water. Her new battle began. Every morning before the sun was high enough to be a threat, and every evening after it had dipped below the horizon, she made the arduous trek. She carried 2 heavy wooden buckets, a yoke across her shoulders helping to distribute the weight. The journey back was a slow, agonizing pilgrimage. Water sloshed over the rims, dark circles staining the dusty ground, each spilled drop a tiny heartbreak. Her shoulders and back ached with a deep, grinding pain. The path became a testament to her will, worn into the dry earth by the passage of her feet. Maeve watched her, her disapproval now laced with a grudging awe. She could not comprehend the source of her daughter's strength, this relentless refusal to yield. She saw Annalise return, her face streaked with sweat and dirt, her clothes soaked, and carefully, lovingly, pour the precious water at the base of each thirsty sapling. It was a ritual of hope in a season of despair. Amidst the struggle, there were small miracles. The trees, though stressed, were creating their own tiny ecosystem. In the slivers of shade they cast, the ground remained darker, holding its moisture a little longer. Rabbits and field mice, seeking refuge from the oppressive heat, made their homes among the roots. A pair of meadowlarks built a nest in the branches of a slightly larger poplar, their song a surprising jewel of sound in the hot, still air. One afternoon, Thomas rode past, his own fields looking scorched and desperate. He stopped, not to mock, but to watch her. He saw the faint but definite line of green that was her property, an anomaly in the parched landscape. He saw the birds take flight from the branches. He didn't speak, but the look on his face was different. The scorn was gone, replaced by a flicker of bewilderment, of a dawning, reluctant respect. He tipped his hat, a gesture he had never made before, and rode on, leaving Anneliese to her work, a silent acknowledgement passing between the skeptic and the believer. The second winter announced its arrival with a fury that made the first seem like a gentle prelude. A blizzard descended from an iron-grey sky, not with a howl, but with a deep, guttural roar that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the frozen north. It was a storm of legends, the kind old-timers would speak of for generations. The snow was not soft but granular and sharp, driven by a wind so powerful it was like a solid wall, a physical force that threatened to dismantle the world. Visibility dropped to zero. To step outside the door was to be instantly lost in a maelstrom of blinding white and deafening sound. Anneliese and Maeve huddled by the stove, feeding it precious wood, listening to the storm try to tear its way into their home. But this time, something was different. The violent shrieking of the wind against the house was muffled, its sharpest edges blunted. The windows rattled, but they did not threaten to shatter. The drafts that had chilled them to the bone the year before were less severe. Anneliese pressed her face to the cold glass of the kitchen window, trying to peer into the chaos. She could see nothing but the storm, yet she could feel the change. Her fortress was working. Her trees, now 2 seasons older, taller and more densely packed, were taking the brunt of the assault. They were a living breakwater, absorbing the storm's initial rage, forcing the wind to rise up and over them, creating a pocket of relative calm in their lee. The snow, instead of scouring the ground bare around the foundation, was piling in huge, soft drifts against the outer ring of trees, adding to the insulation. For 3 days the storm raged. When it finally broke, the silence was as profound as the noise had been. The world was remade, buried under a monolithic blanket of white. A few hours later, a figure appeared, struggling through the immense drifts. It was Thomas. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide with shock. He stumbled onto her porch, his clothes frozen stiff. "The roof," he stammered, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "Half my barn roof, it's gone. Just torn away." "The wind?" He looked past her, at her house, standing solid and secure. Then his gaze moved to the wall of trees surrounding it, their branches heavy with snow but unbroken. He saw how the drifts were banked against them, protecting the clearing within. He finally understood. It wasn't madness. It was architecture. "How?" he asked, his voice filled with a raw, humbled wonder. "All this time? I thought you were a fool." Anneliese simply opened the door wider. "Come in, Thomas. There is coffee." That blizzard marked a turning point, not just in the seasons, but in the soul of the small community. Thomas, once her most vocal detractor, became her staunchest ally. He returned the next day with his 2 strong sons, and without a word of instruction, they began helping her clear pathways and check the trees for damage. He spoke of the storm in town, his voice carrying the weight of a convert. He described how the wind had flattened his weather vane and torn shingles from the church roof, yet Anneliese's small house had been sheltered within its living shield. People listened. The mockery that had followed Anneliese like a shadow began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet, grudging curiosity. That spring, Thomas appeared with a wagon loaded with saplings he had purchased himself. "My Westfield needs a windbreak," he said, avoiding her eyes, a faint flush of embarrassment on his weathered cheeks. Thought you might advise me on the matter." It was an apology and a plea, a recognition of a wisdom he had once scorned. Annalise walked with him, her hands tracing the patterns of bark, explaining what Daniel's journal had taught her about placement, about mixing flexible poplars with sturdy pines to create a wall that would bend but not break. A fragile alliance was forged, one rooted in the shared soil of survival. Her life began to ease in small but significant ways. Mr. Gable at the store started extending her credit again, a warm smile returning to his face. "Always knew you were made of sterner stuff," he'd say, waving away her thanks. Someone left a brace of rabbits on her porch one morning, another time, a sack of potatoes. There were no notes, no fanfare, just the quiet offerings of a community beginning to see her not as the mad widow, but as a woman of profound and stubborn strength. Maeve, too, underwent a transformation. The fear in her eyes was slowly replaced by a fierce pride. She began to tend a small garden in the sheltered clearing behind the house, a space now protected from the wind's constant harassment. The vegetables grew straight and strong. She would sit on the porch in the evenings, the sound of the wind in the growing branches no longer a threat, but a lullaby. "Daniel would be so proud," she said one evening, her voice thick with emotion. Annalise looked out at the thriving green walls that defined her world. The trees were no longer just saplings, they were adolescents, their branches beginning to interlace, weaving the fortress he had dreamed of. The deadline on Mr. Hemlock's letter loomed, but for the first time, Annalise felt not dread, but a burgeoning hope. Her shield was growing. The end of summer arrived with a suffocating, oppressive heat. The air was dry as tinder, and a strange, nervous energy seemed to hum just beneath the surface of the world. For weeks, there had been no rain, and the vast prairie was a sea of cured, golden grass, beautiful and terrifying in its flammability. Annalise felt a primal anxiety she couldn't name, watching the horizon, her gaze drawn to the towering thunderheads that would build in the afternoons, promising relief but delivering only dry lightning that spiderwebbed across the purple sky. The fire started 10 miles to the southwest, a single, malevolent spark from one of those strikes. Fanned by a strong, hot wind, it became an unstoppable force, a roaring, galloping beast of pure consumption. The warning came as a frantic rider, his face black with soot, shouting for the town to gather its brigades. But Annalise knew the town was too far. The fire was moving too fast. Her home stood directly in its path. From her porch, she watched the smoke plume grow from a smudge to a monstrous, churning wall that blotted out the sun. A rain of fine grey ash began to fall, dusting the green leaves of her trees. Maeve came to stand beside her, her hand finding Annalise's. There was no panic in her touch, only a profound, shared stillness. They had done all they could. The fate of their world now rested in the living walls around them. The roar grew louder, a sound that vibrated deep in her chest, the sound of 1,000 freight trains bearing down on them. The air grew hot, thick with the acrid smell of destruction. Small animals, deer and rabbits and prairie dogs, fled before the inferno, some of them darting into the relative safety of her woods. Then the fire front was upon them. It was not a line of flames, it was a solid wall of orange and black, hundreds of feet high, a tidal wave of heat and death. It slammed into the outer perimeter of her forest. The poplars and aspens on the western edge, the ones that had borne the brunt of the winter winds, now faced a new enemy. Their leaves crisped and vanished in an instant. Their bark blackened. They became torches. But their sacrifice was not in vain. They absorbed the initial, explosive force of the fire. Their living wood, full of the water Annalise had so painstakingly carried, refused to combust as easily as the dry grass. It steamed, it sizzled, it smoked, slowing the fire's advance from a gallop to a crawl. The dense canopy starved the flames of the wind that drove them, forcing the blaze to fight for every inch. Inside the green perimeter, the world turned into a surreal hell. The light was a flickering, blood orange, and the heat was a physical presence that made it difficult to breathe. The roar of the main fire was a constant, deafening thunder, punctuated by the sharp crack of exploding trees at the fire's edge. Annalise and Maeve retreated inside the farmhouse, stuffing wet rags into the cracks around the doors and windows as smoke began to seep in. Through the wavy glass, Anneliese could see the fire wrestling with her trees. It was a battle of two living forces, the wild, chaotic hunger of the flames against the stubborn, rooted resilience of the forest. The outer ring of trees was a line of black, skeletal martyrs, but behind them, the next line held. And the next. The fire, robbed of its momentum and starved of oxygen by the dense foliage, began to falter. It could not punch through. Its immense power was being diffused, baffled by the intricate, living labyrinth she had cultivated. It was like watching a great beast exhaust itself against the bars of a cage it could not break. The main front of the inferno, following the path of least resistance, found it easier to flow around her property than through it. The great river of fire split, its two arms racing past on either side, leaving her homestead an island of green in a sea of black. The immediate danger passed, but the vigil continued for hours. Embers, carried on the superheated wind, rained down like malevolent fireflies, seeking any purchase they could find. They landed on the roof of the house, on the porch, in the small garden. But the air within the grove was cooler, more humid. The ground was damper. Most of the embers died with a faint hiss on contact. Anneliese, bucket in hand, moved through the smoky twilight of her sanctuary, extinguishing the small spot fires that managed to start, her movements calm and deliberate. As the sun finally set on a world transformed, the orange glow on the horizon began to fade. The immediate roar subsided, replaced by the crackle and pop of the smoldering plains. The farmhouse, a bit smoky and covered in ash, was entirely unharmed. Anneliese stepped out onto the porch and took a deep, shuddering breath of hot, smoky air. She looked out at the blackened, glowing landscape that stretched in every direction, a vision of utter desolation. And then she looked at her trees. The outer edge was scorched, a ring of sacrifice. But the heart of her forest, the core of Daniel's fortress, was alive. It was damaged and choked with smoke, but it was standing. They had survived. They had held.